Have you ever wondered what happens to an empath after surviving narcissistic abuse? What Carl Jung discovered about the human psyche reveals a profound transformation that occurs in the deepest recesses of our being. Today, we're diving into Jung's revolutionary understanding of how empaths don't just recover from narcissistic abuse, they undergo a complete metamorphosis that he called the final stage of psychological evolution. If you've been through the hell of narcissistic manipulation, if you've felt your empathic gifts turned against you like weapons, then what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about your journey. This isn't just about healing. It's about emerging as something far more powerful than you ever imagined possible. Jung spent decades studying the human psyche, and he identified patterns in how deeply sensitive individuals, what we now call empaths, respond to psychological trauma. He found that those who possess heightened emotional sensitivity don't just bounce back from abuse. They transform in ways that fundamentally alter their relationship with themselves and the world around them. Before we dive deep into this transformation, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're exploring the most profound aspects of Jung's work that most people never hear about. The insights we're sharing today could be the key to understanding your own journey of recovery and transformation. Let me tell you about Sarah, a client I worked with who exemplifies this journey perfectly. Sarah was a nurse, naturally empathic, always putting others' needs before her own. She attracted a narcissistic partner who systematically dismantled her sense of self over 3 years. He isolated her from friends, criticized her empathy as weakness, and convinced her that her natural caring nature was somehow flawed. When Sarah finally escaped that relationship, she thought she was broken beyond repair. She questioned everything about herself. Was her empathy really a weakness? Had she been naive and foolish? Jung would have recognized Sarah's experience immediately because he understood that empaths who survive narcissistic abuse go through what he termed a necessary destruction of the false self. This destruction isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of something extraordinary. Jung believed that true psychological growth often requires what he called the dark night of the soul, a period where everything you thought you knew about yourself crumbles away. For empaths recovering from narcissistic abuse, this dark night serves a very specific purpose. The narcissist's manipulation actually reveals to the empath all the ways they've been living inauthentically, all the ways they've been giving away their power, all the boundaries they never learned to set. It's excruciating, but it's also illuminating. Jung identified what he called the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming your authentic self. For empaths who've survived narcissistic abuse, this process takes on a unique and accelerated form. The trauma acts as a catalyst, forcing them to confront aspects of their psyche they might have avoided for decades. In Jung's framework, empaths begin this journey in what he termed the persona stage. This is the mask we wear to fit into society, to be accepted, to avoid conflict. Sarah, our nurse, had crafted a persona of the selfless caregiver, always available, never demanding, perpetually accommodating. This persona attracted her narcissistic partner like a magnet, because narcissists instinctively seek out those who've learned to suppress their own needs. The narcissist doesn't just abuse the empath, they systematically dismantle this carefully constructed persona. They criticize the empath's kindness as stupidity, their compassion as weakness, their sensitivity as overreaction. At first, this feels devastating. The empath tries desperately to repair their persona, to be even more giving, more understanding, more accommodating. But Jung understood something crucial. This destruction of the persona is actually necessary for psychological growth. He wrote that we must lose ourselves to find ourselves, and for empaths, narcissistic abuse forces this loss in the most painful way possible. Consider Maria, another example. She was a teacher who prided herself on seeing the best in everyone. Her narcissistic husband convinced her, that her positive outlook was naive, that her trust in people was foolish. He systematically destroyed her confidence in her own perceptions. When she finally left him after 5 years, Maria felt like she couldn't trust her own judgment about anything. What Maria didn't realize was that she was entering what Jung called the shadow work phase of recovery. The shadow contains all the parts of ourselves we've rejected or denied. For empaths, the shadow often contains healthy anger, appropriate selfishness, and the ability to say no without guilt. The narcissistic abuse forces empaths to confront these shadow aspects. Sarah had to acknowledge her suppressed anger about being taken advantage of. Maria had to face her fear of being seen as selfish or unkind. This confrontation with the shadow is terrifying because empaths have built their entire identity around being good, kind, and selfless. Jung believed that integrating the shadow was essential for psychological wholeness. He said we cannot become whole by remaining only light. We must embrace our darkness too. For empaths recovering from narcissistic abuse, this means learning to access their healthy aggression, their appropriate selfishness, their right to have boundaries, and enforce them. This shadow integration phase often feels like becoming someone you don't recognize. The shadow integration phase is where many empaths feel the most confused and guilty. Sarah found herself snapping at coworkers who tried to dump extra responsibilities on her. Maria discovered a fierce protective instinct when someone criticized her children. Both women worried they were becoming mean, selfish, or unlikable. Jung would have assured them that this discomfort was not only normal, but necessary. He understood that psychological growth requires what he called the tension of opposites. The empath must learn to hold both their natural compassion and their healthy boundaries, both their desire to help others and their need for self-care. This is where Jung's concept of the anima and animus becomes crucial for understanding the empath's journey. The anima represents the feminine principle of receptivity, intuition, and emotional connection. The animus represents the masculine principle of assertion, logic, and action. Jung believed that psychological wholeness required integrating both principles, regardless of biological gender. Most empaths, especially women, have overdeveloped their anima qualities while suppressing their animus. They're incredibly receptive to others' emotions, highly intuitive about people's needs, and deeply connected to the emotional realm. But they've learned to suppress their assertive, logical, action-oriented side. The narcissistic abuse forces this integration. When Sarah's partner criticized her decisions, she had to develop her logical thinking to counter his manipulation. When Maria's husband isolated her from friends, she had to access her assertive energy to rebuild those connections. The trauma literally forces empaths to develop their underdeveloped psychological functions. Jung called this process an antiodromia, the tendency for things to turn into their opposite when taken to an extreme. The empath's extreme selflessness eventually transforms into healthy self-regard. Their excessive accommodation becomes appropriate boundary setting. Their overgiving evolves into balanced reciprocity. Let me share the story of Rebecca, a social worker who spent 10 years in a relationship with a narcissistic partner who convinced her that her professional success was threatening to their relationship. He systematically undermined her confidence, telling her she was too aggressive at work, too ambitious, too focused on her career. By the time Rebecca left the relationship, she had internalized his criticisms so deeply that she was considering leaving her profession entirely. She believed she had become someone cold and calculating, that her drive for social justice was really just masked selfishness. What Rebecca didn't understand was that her partner had been threatened by her integrated animus energy, her ability to combine compassion with effective action. He systematically tried to suppress this integration because it made him feel inadequate. The abuse was actually his attempt to force her back into a purely receptive, anima-dominated state where she would be less threatening to his ego. Jung's work reveals that this attack on the empath's growing integration is a common pattern in narcissistic abuse. The narcissist unconsciously recognizes when the empath begins to individuate, when they start developing psychological wholeness, and this triggers the narcissist's deepest fears of abandonment and inadequacy. They escalate their manipulation precisely when the empath is making the most progress toward authentic selfhood. This is why the final stages of narcissistic relationships often become the most intense and damaging. The narcissist senses they're losing control over someone who's becoming psychologically complete. They may love bomb, threaten, guilt trip, or engage in increasingly desperate tactics to pull the empath back into their underdeveloped state. Jung identified this phenomenon in his work on psychological projection. The narcissist projects their own inner fragmentation onto the empath, trying to keep them fragmented as well. They cannot tolerate being around someone who's achieving the integration they themselves lack. Rebecca experienced this escalation firsthand. As she began to recognize her partner's manipulation and started setting boundaries, he became increasingly volatile. He accused her of becoming a different person, of losing her compassion, of becoming selfish and cold. What he was really experiencing was his terror of being with someone who was no longer willing to remain psychologically incomplete for his comfort. When empaths finally break free from narcissistic abuse, they enter what Jung considered the most crucial phase of psychological development, the encounter with what he called the self with a capital S. This is different from the ego self, the everyday personality. The self represents the totality of the psyche, the integrated whole that includes both conscious and unconscious elements. For empaths, this encounter with the self often feels like meeting a stranger who is somehow completely familiar. Sarah described it as feeling like she was remembering who she had always been underneath all the conditioning and people-pleasing. Maria said it felt like coming home to herself after a lifetime of living in other people's houses. Jung believed that this encounter with the self was often precipitated by what he called a transcendent function, a psychological mechanism that bridges the conscious and unconscious minds. For empaths recovering from narcissistic abuse, this transcendent function is often activated by the sheer necessity of survival. The abuse strips away so many layers of false identity that what remains is closer to the authentic self than the empath has ever experienced. It's as if the narcissist, in trying to destroy the empath, accidentally reveals their indestructible core. This is where the empath begins to understand that their sensitivity was never a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be integrated with other psychological functions. They realize that their capacity for deep feeling, when combined with healthy boundaries and assertive action, becomes a formidable force for positive change in the world. The final stage that Jung identified involves what he called the transcendent function, becoming a permanent part of the empath's psychological toolkit. In this final stage, the empath develops what Jung termed psychological sovereignty. They no longer need external validation to know who they are. They've integrated their shadow, balanced their anima and animus energies, and established a conscious relationship with their authentic self. But most importantly, they've learned to trust their own inner knowing above all external voices. Sarah, our nurse, exemplifies this transformation beautifully. 3 years after leaving her narcissistic partner, she had not only returned to her profession, but had become a charge nurse, leading a team with both compassion and firm boundaries. She could feel others' emotions without taking them on as her own. She could offer support without sacrificing her own well-being. She had become what Jung would call an individuated empath. The final stage empath possesses what Jung called differentiated feeling. They can distinguish between their emotions and others' emotions with remarkable clarity. They've developed what he termed the feeling function to its highest level, where it becomes a reliable guide for navigating complex interpersonal situations. Maria transformed from a teacher who couldn't say no to anyone into an educational administrator who could make difficult decisions with both heart and wisdom. She learned to trust her intuitive assessments of people while also setting clear professional boundaries. Her empathy became a strategic asset rather than a vulnerability. Rebecca returned to social work with a renewed sense of purpose, but now she combined her natural compassion with what Jung would call developed thinking and sensation functions. She could analyze systemic problems logically, take decisive action when needed, and maintain emotional boundaries with clients while still providing genuine care. This is what Jung meant by psychological wholeness. These women didn't lose their empathy or become cold and calculating. Instead, they developed all their psychological functions to work in harmony. They became what Jung called complete human beings. The final stage empath has also developed what Jung termed ethical autonomy. They no longer need others to tell them what's right or wrong. They've developed an internal moral compass that guides their decisions. This is crucial because narcissists often target empaths' moral uncertainty, convincing them that their natural ethical instincts are wrong. But perhaps most importantly, the final stage empath has learned to hold what Jung called the tension of opposites without collapsing into either extreme. They can be both caring and boundaried, both open and discerning, both trusting and wise. If you've survived narcissistic abuse and recognize yourself in this journey, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we dive deep into these psychological transformations that can change your life. Your experience wasn't just random suffering. It was a catalyst for the kind of growth that Jung spent his lifetime studying. The final stage empath represents what Jung called the return of the hero, but with a twist that he found particularly fascinating when studying highly sensitive individuals. Unlike the traditional hero's journey that focuses on conquering external challenges, the empath's journey is about conquering the internal compulsion to save everyone else at the expense of their own soul. Jung observed that empaths who reach this final stage develop what he termed sacred selfishness. This isn't the destructive narcissism they survived, but rather a divine responsibility to protect and nurture their own psychological and spiritual well-being. They understand that their sensitivity is a gift that requires careful stewardship, not reckless abandonment. This transformation is profound because it reverses everything the empath previously believed about their role in the world. Before the abuse, they believed their value came from how much they could give, how much they could absorb, how much they could heal in others. After the transformation, they understand that their greatest gift to the world is their own wholeness. The final stage empath has learned to distinguish between genuine compassion and trauma bonding. Jung would have recognized this as the difference between love that flows from abundance and love that flows from woundedness. When Sarah helps a colleague now, she does so from a place of choice rather than compulsion. When Maria supports a struggling student, she maintains her own emotional equilibrium throughout the interaction. This is where Jung's concept of the self with a capital S becomes most relevant. These empaths have established what he called a conscious relationship with their own deepest nature. They know who they are beneath all the conditioning, all the trauma, all the social expectations. This knowing becomes their North Star, guiding every decision and relationship. Perhaps most remarkably, the final stage empath has developed immunity to manipulation, not through cynicism or coldness, but through what Jung called differentiated consciousness. They can sense manipulation attempts immediately because they're no longer dissociated from their own inner knowing. Their empathy becomes a sophisticated early warning system rather than a doorway for exploitation. Jung believed that individuals who achieved this level of integration became what he called carriers of consciousness for the collective. They don't just transform their own lives, they contribute to the evolution of human awareness itself. They model what it looks like to be both deeply feeling and powerfully boundaried, both genuinely caring and completely self-possessed. The final stage empath embodies Jung's vision of the individuated person who has achieved what he called the marriage of heaven and earth within their own psyche. they've learned to be human in the fullest sense of the word, embracing both their divine capacity for love and their human need for protection and boundaries. Your journey through narcissistic abuse was never punishment. It was initiation into this ancient process of becoming fully yourself.